Hey, all you Feminerds out there, this is Beckah.
And this is Leigh.
And this is File 741 on the feminerdfiles.net. We have a review. We're going to be talking about the comic Giant Days, which was written by John Allison and illustrated by several people. But first, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about why we do this podcast. So since we started, we haven't really gotten into that, what our format is, and I thought we could start by talking about that. So Leigh, why don't you start by telling us why you were interested in doing this podcast?
Absolutely. So this podcast is actually a part of the Feminerd Files, which was started by Monica Rubino, who's an amazing human being.
Yes.
And she wanted to create some sort of format or forum for people who are interested in learning more about strong female characters or queer characters in media, and that could be any type of media, but mostly in entertainment. So we kind of started the podcast with roundtables where we discussed mostly movies or TV shows that had these kind of qualities to them. So that's how I started on this project. I've always been interested in podcasting. I just didn't really know how to do that or how to begin that, but it was always something in the back of my mind that I wanted to do, and I didn't know what I would do it on either. But I really enjoyed the experience of the roundtables and getting to be part of this. And then I have my very good friend Beckah, who is a librarian and who is also interested in comics and things like that. And so she had mentioned to me about maybe doing a podcast about reviewing comics under the same kind of pretense of the Feminerds. And that's kind of how we started this. And I've really, really enjoyed it. It's one of my absolute favorite things.
Yeah, so fun. It's been really, really fun to not only talk about comics that we both know and love, but to also discover new things. Because for our reviews, we like to focus on indie comics or things that aren't as well known. We also, of course, are really interested in female or queer character-centered stories, and the issues of representation. And so that is something that we're both really interested in, and kind of what we bring to this podcast. We're also both really interested in the process of creating comics. I'm a writer, Leigh is an artist, and so we both kind of have this someday goal of like putting together a comic someday, but we really like to talk to writers and artists about their processes, their inspiration, and how they go about actually creating a comic. And then of course we're also interested in supporting and promoting local artists and comics, and again, like indie stuff. So we haven't really talked about in the past a whole run of a series when we're doing these reviews, mostly because what we like to talk about story and characters and the artwork and kind of the structure of the comic, how it's put together. But we want these reviews to be more like, hey, here's this cool thing that you should check out. This is kind of the style that you would be looking at, so we can generate interest, and people can go out and discover the stories on their own, and that way there's no like spoilers, and it's kind of fun to discover those stories knowing only a little bit about it.
Yes, I agree with that.
Cool. So we're going to go ahead and dive into our review of this comic called Giant Days. Leigh, can you give us just like a little bit of information about it?
Yes. I have just a small snippet. So I would describe this as three new friends from different walks of life. They are college freshmen, and they are floor mates with rooms right next to each other. And they have seemingly ordinary adventures, but they experience it in extraordinary ways.
Yes. Very good. So let's talk a little bit about the characters that show up in this comic. So the three main characters are all female. There is Susan, who is brash and very obviously flawed. She definitely feels a little older than the other characters. I wrote down that she maybe has more quote-unquote life experience, but she just feels more mature. She's a little abrasive, but she clearly also has a lot of maturing to do, some growing up, some issues with personal relationships. I'm not really sure what her goals are, but you know, being a young person in her first year at university, that's okay. We can get into that. What were your notes about Susan?
I put Susan as somebody who seems like she's naturally antisocial, but she's been thrown in a social situation. So this is her trying to adapt to that. It seems like she's very dedicated to her studies compared to all the rest of the characters, and she's really trying to succeed in college. I don't know if she's doing it well, but she is trying. And I also put that she tends to be more of the feminist character, who has the strong opinions, and she's kind of hot-tempered and grumpy at times.
Yeah, she's definitely more outspoken about her feminism than the other two. Then there's Esther. Esther is a really fun, interesting character. She has a very established personality. I think that she also has, it feels like, a lot of experience, but she also maintains a sense of innocence to me. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but she's definitely excited about the world. She's curious. She struggles with the structure of university life. And so it just seems like she's got this kind of young energy where she wants to try a lot of different things. She's got a really fun style that's very goth, but also is very flexible. And I think she is just really comfortable being able to express herself.
Yes, I agree with that. Goth was the first thing I said to describe her. I also said that she was kind of got this badass, rebellious feel to her, but she's also kind of a nonconformist. Not necessarily antisocial. I think she enjoys being social, but she definitely does not like, you know, the popularity or the different social groups type thing. She likes to kind of be on her own in that sense. And she tends to be the one that attracts the most drama, I would say, of all the characters. So a lot of their little adventures they get into tend to stem from her storylines.
Yeah, and what I kind of like about Esther, I think she's one of my favorites, is that drama, she doesn't create that drama, and she doesn't necessarily thrive on that, but it's definitely a part of her. So she doesn't go around creating these situations in which she will be the center of attention unless it's on purpose, like at the bar when they're trying to rescue Susan.
Right.
But other than that, she just kind of has this wildness about her that makes her a little unpredictable, which is pretty fun. Daisy, who is also a great character, she's a little bit harder to pin down personality-wise. I think she's very bright, she's intelligent, she's nerdy. She definitely seems a little younger, very excited about kind of university life. She was homeschooled, and so this seems like her first experience in this kind of social setting where she's living away from home, and has these new friends, and she doesn't seem to struggle with that very much. Like, she doesn't express a lot of homesickness, but she is very quirky. She's friends with a pigeon, and she does seem a little unfocused. I think her stories have a hard time landing for me. They feel a little bit all over the place sometimes. And she's queer in some way. We don't really know what that is yet, because that doesn't really... these 3 volumes don't really go into that, which was a little disappointing. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, that's Daisy. Yes,
Daisy is a character that I probably could relate a little bit to when I was a freshman, because I was kind of naive going into college. And I want so much more from her character than what we've seen in these volumes, which we will go through soon. But I was super excited to see a nerdy character who's a little naive and optimistic. She's kind of got a hippie side to her, or new age, and that she was queer. I really, really wanted to, have that be the diversity in this comic. And they do touch upon it in the first volume, most definitely, but they kind of shy away from it a little bit throughout future volumes. So I'm hoping that after volume 3, which there are lots of volumes out for this, we just haven't reviewed them, but I'm hoping that will end up panning out more and being part of the story more.
Yeah, for sure. And then outside of this group of 3 women, we have 2 male characters who are also kind of part of this friend group. There's McGraw, who I described as a lumbersexual. He's got a great mustache. He feels very mature and gentlemanly, and very honest. He seems to... he has this past with Susan where they clearly had some sort of relationship that then didn't work out. They're from the same hometown, and Susan didn't realize that he would be there at the university, but then they kind of make up and realize what it was they liked about each other, and so he clearly wants some more from her, and then I think her abrasive kind of leave me alone kind of personality gets in the way of that sometimes.
Yes, that's a very good way of describing him. I put him as a mystery man from Susan's past and who she now considers an enemy. And he doesn't seem very fazed by it, though. She keeps trying to get under his skin and warn him that he needs to stay away. And he just continues with his day and doesn't really worry about it, but still checks in and is very polite with her. He kind of tends to be that male feminist character as well, which is probably a really good counterpart to her.
Yeah, and I think once they kind of get back on the same page for a little bit, he seems to fit in with the group really well, and they have a really great dynamic. And then there's Ed. Ed is also probably one of my favorite characters. I thought that he was really relatable. He seems very young and awkward, love struck with Esther at the beginning of these volumes. Really kind of open and innocent, and so very honest and very, there's a lot about him that feels very natural. And so we too are speculating that maybe the author is a little bit closer to Ed than any of the other characters, and that's why he feels a little bit more real.
Yeah, totally was my first impression of Ed. He's very awkward. He's a little quirky nerd, and has that big crush on Esther, which is a continuing storyline through the whole thing. And his character seems to be the most fleshed out of all of the characters, so it made me wonder if maybe the author related to Ed in some way. And it also made me wonder about the remaining characters, if maybe they were kind of based off of his friend group in college, and these are their experiences that he's trying to, bring back to light. And maybe he just didn't want a story that was just based off of a boy who had a crush on a girl in college, and he kind of wanted to, make it more unique or try from a different perspective or something, and that's why he chose 3 female characters to be the leads. I don't know.
Yeah. This story does take place in England, which I only picked up. Somebody said something in a way that I was like, oh, they sound English to me, the way they said that. So it's not super, the country of England is not really a huge part of this story. It could really take place anywhere. And when I first started it, I had a really hard time. I tried to switch in my head to have them have English accents, and it just didn't work for me. I just, for some reason, they just sounded better in American accents. Sorry.
No, I agree. It's hard to tell whether it would have been an American or British comic, because it's very similar to a college experience in America as well. The only thing that was kind of my clue is that they don't call it college; they call it university.
Yeah, university.
Yeah, and so that was my first clue of, maybe this is British.
Yeah, and then they talk about London a bit, and when they leave college to go home, they kind of mention different places, and there's only a couple parts where somebody is written, their dialogue is written in a way that is very obviously has an accent. But I also know very little about English geography, so I don't know if any of those towns are like north or south or what sort of accent they would have.
That's true. We have one last character.
Oh, yes.
Nadia.
Oh, yes.
Yes, Nadia is primarily just in the first volume. This was the character that I really wanted to see a little bit more of as well. Nadia is Daisy's crush when we find out that Daisy is queer, but who really does like Daisy but wants to be just friends with Daisy. And Daisy has trouble with that and how to deal with that and how to just be a friend when you have a crush on somebody. Plus, it seems... I don't know. I'm not sure... Maybe because Daisy was homeschooled, she didn't really have a lot of time to really consider her sexuality that much. So I'm wondering if maybe this is like a first-time crush for her and she's trying to figure out her sexuality. So Nadia is kind of her way of doing that. This is her first time having those feelings, maybe. I don't know. But it was interesting to see their interactions between them, and I wanted a little bit more from that. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point. I didn't really think about the fact that Daisy wouldn't have ever really been in this kind of social situation. She talks to Esther a little bit later about, just because she's homeschooled doesn't mean she was locked up in a room, and never spoke to any other people ever. But yeah, she might not have had a similar crush situation, or she might have had crushes on some people, but just not to the same extent. I do appreciate when Esther kind of approaches Nadia and is like, why aren't you into Daisy? Like, what's your problem? And Nadia's like, it's okay to be friends with somebody and not be into them at the same time. So I kind of appreciated that little piece, because sometimes it's not really acknowledged that everybody has feelings and they may be different, but that they're also valid.
Yes, and just because somebody has a crush on you doesn't mean that you have to respond in the same way. I also appreciated that it was Esther who made that conversation, because that's kind of the same situation she's in with Ed.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to some extent Esther doesn't think about Ed in that way, and so I don't know that she's even aware of Ed's crush. Do you think she's aware of it?
I don't know. I kind of feel like she's more clued in than what she sometimes shows. So I think deep down she probably knows.
Just doesn't want to.
Because, I mean, their interactions every now and then get a little flirty sometimes. Yeah. So I just can't imagine that she just doesn't know at all. But I don't know. Maybe she just doesn't want to think about that. Maybe she just would like to keep it the way it is.
Interesting. So that's a good segue to start talking about the story in general. So I will be honest and say this was not my favorite comic that we've read. I did really like a lot of aspects of it. I thought it was fun and interesting. But and charming, I think. But to me, the stakes never really felt high enough. I know it's been described as like a slice of life sort of thing, and it is about kind of teen/young adult life. That's a little bit removed from where I am right now in my life. But I felt like it couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. If it wanted to be like a school story about like university challenges and everything that goes with being a new student, or if it just wanted to be kind of these little stories about this group of friends, which it could be both, but I kind of wanted a little bit more. I wanted either, I think, more about what each person was studying. I guess Susan's a medical student.
Yeah.
But Esther doesn't seem to have a focus, and I don't know what Daisy was studying. Maybe literature? I don't know. So I kind of wanted a little bit more of that, or kind of more high stakes, or everything feels a little bit more high stakes. So maybe that's the point, that it didn't really ever feel like anything really mattered, but it didn't quite work for me.
I agree with that. It does kind of hit and miss in different ways. I feel like you could have a good comic with all those elements. I would love some more detail. I would love some more background. I would love the characters to be a little bit more fleshed out. And but I did appreciate that the story continues for each chapter. I think I would have been more annoyed if each story or each chapter was a completely different story. They tend to at least continue their storylines, which I appreciate. And I think in some ways that's the point of it, that it's just a slice of life type thing, and it's just a continuing story of average kids' lives. But at the same time, I kind of have a selfish adoration of this comic, and the reason I do is because it's kind of awakened to me my style of art in some ways. I've always wanted to create my own comic. That was something that was a childhood dream of mine, and I've struggled with it over the years because I didn't know what stories I would do. I didn't feel like my life was that interesting enough to create in a comic around it. And I struggled with coming up with my own character design. That seems like something that shouldn't be that difficult, but it actually really is. And so from taking classes about comics or different art mentors that I've had over the years, they've always said, try to find a comic that speaks to you and that, is the style that you like, and kind of learn from that, like figure out what you like and what you don't like by reading a lot of comics, which is what I do. And when I came across this comic, I felt like this would have been my type of comic that I would have created for myself at the beginning, and all the things that I want to see out of it would be things that I would do in my own comic. But the drawing style and everything is just very similar to how I would do it. And so for me, it's one that I kind of hold to my heart because it feels very much like something I would have created at some point. And so we'll go more into the art later and everything like that. But that's one of the reasons why I liked this comic and I suggested it for it. So yeah, it's a personal love.
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't even think about that because what I read most tends to be more science fiction related. And so, not that I find this sort of thing boring, because I definitely I've been reading a lot more like YA fiction, young adult fiction, which I really enjoyed. That, and so there are definitely things about it that I really liked. But as far as like story goes, it's just not necessarily what what's the word I'm trying to think of, like interesting to me. But that's really cool that I really like that connection to your own style and your own story, and how much of a gateway comic it was for you.
Absolutely.
That's really awesome. And kind of going along those same lines of like what felt the most relatable, to me, I thought that in volume 3, Ed's story about his kind of sexual awakening was the most interesting bit to me. A lot of this kind of storylines felt a little bit clunky. I feel like I can describe it better when I'm watching a movie and I can tell that the editing is not quite right. And so that's kind of how I felt when I was reading this sometimes, that like a joke kind of cut off too quickly, or a kind of storyline moved on too quickly. But with Ed's story in volume 3, I felt like it was the most focused that the comic had been. Just like with Daisy, we were talking about, all of a sudden we kind of understand she has this crush on this girl and it doesn't really go anywhere. And her friends are very supportive and are like, that's okay. Like, I like what Susan says when she's like, kiss both types of faces and see which ones you like better. And so they're very supportive of that, but that doesn't ever really go anywhere. At least not in these 3 volumes, and not to a very satisfying place. I wanted to see a little bit more of that self-discovery that Ed gets a little later. And I think Esther's storyline where she is dating the teacher's aide is also kind of interesting, because that also has this element of she's feels so self-confident and so sure of herself, and then all of a sudden she's in this relationship with somebody and she can't relate to their friends and his friends, and she can't kind of keep up with the conversation, and that's very difficult for her to understand, but she bounces back from that pretty quickly as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that too with her character. I feel like Esther's character is used a lot to kind of have social commentary. She tends to get a lot of male attraction, and it's usually unwanted attraction, and so they have to deal with that quite a bit as a group of, trying to find creative ways of getting back at these male characters that tend to objectify women on campus. And
yeah, that was an interesting little bit.
Yeah.
I that storyline I loved at first, and then it got into this weird territory where Susan put out this magazine that was
yeah,
which I mean it kind of made sense to be like, these guys are sleazeballs and don't allow them to do this sort of thing. But then it became this weird, she became this feminist icon for these kids, and her zine had been reprinted, and then I have no idea where it went from there.
Yeah,
it got kind of this weird, somebody accused her of what is the word, misandry. I don't know if that's really the right word, but men hating kind of situation, and then it didn't really go anywhere.
True, but that also is another good point, because it sometimes happens as well. So I feel like they brought in a lot of different social aspects, but maybe just didn't flesh them out the way would have been nice to learn from this, experience. This was the lesson of this.
Yeah, because I could have had a whole volume about that situation. I could have had probably a whole volume about Esther's situation, probably a whole volume about the whole political situation that was going on in campus that also felt like it was supposed to be more relevant or more impactful than it ended up being, which again is maybe the point, that these things sometimes are very important in a short amount of time, and then it no longer becomes important.
That could be. I feel like that kind of speaks to the college experience. There's so much going on campus, and things are really important for 5 minutes, and then something else happens, and then I got to study for this test, and then I got to do all these things. So maybe that's kind of the feel of the comic as well. And maybe if he is basing this on some sort of personal experience, maybe he doesn't know what happened in those situations and he's taking a guess, or maybe they didn't pan out, maybe they didn't go further than what they did. I don't know. It leaves a lot of questions.
Yeah, very interesting. Do you want to talk about the structure now a little bit?
Absolutely.
Unless you have more insight about the story you would like to go into a little bit more deeper?
The structure of this comic, I appreciated it being quite basic. Sometimes that's annoying in a comic when it's too basic, but for this, I felt it fit. And I really appreciated, from the artist side of me, I enjoy comics that have a lot of detail and have a lot going on in their backgrounds, but as an actual artist, that's really difficult to do. So I appreciated that this comic had a basic layout, and I appreciated that the backgrounds were basic and simple and had as much detail that was necessary in each panel, but it wasn't overdone. And I feel like that's something, as a personal artist who wants to create their own comic, is doable.
That's a really great perspective. Basic is also the word that I wrote down, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It was pretty straightforward. The panels were pretty uniform. They were different sizes, but each page was pretty uniform, except for the sequences when Susan goes out at night and everything's wonky and wobbly, and that was kind of fun. Other than that, I will say, for me, there weren't any panels that were very memorable. I know that a lot of times when we read comics or talk about comics, there's like a page or two that really stick out in our minds because of how effective they are, or how beautiful or horrifying or whatever is going on. And I didn't really feel that with this particular story. But going along with that idea of things being kind of straightforward and nothing is like so over the top or outside of the realm of possibility, that does make sense that the style would match the kind of situations that are going on. I did really like the artwork. I thought it was really fun and bright. I thought it was realistic enough to feel like it's set in the real world, but it's also loose enough to kind of play around with physics and the backgrounds and stuff, which were really fun.
Yeah, I almost have a feeling like when I read this that this could have easily been a comic strip, and these are just collections of the comic strip.
Yeah.
I almost feel like this could be a comic that was in their university paper, and this is just the collections of it in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. I'm always wishing for more diverse body types.
Yes.
I think with a lot of the new stuff that's coming out, where we get to see that, when I go back to a comic that doesn't have that, I feel a little disappointed, and it is an all white main cast. You do see some diversity in skin tone and body type in some of the extra characters that show up, but I wished there was a little bit more. I also was really annoyed with the character of Lindsay, like Esther's friend who came to visit, and she kept calling her Big Lindsay, and then when she showed up I was like, because she's tall? Like, I didn't understand why she needed the qualifier to be called Big Lindsay. It felt gross. I didn't like that.
Yeah, I agree. I very much agree with that.
So on that note, let's talk a little bit about the fact that this comic was written by a man, or a male identified person, as far as I know.
Yes. Do you want to start?
Sure. I was just going to say that there are definitely male identified writers in comics that write female characters with a lot of sensitivity and a lot of authenticity. I think of the man who writes Princeless, which we'll definitely do a review of coming up soon, or like Brave Chef Brianna. But this comic felt a little bit like I liked the characters, and I felt to a certain extent they were interesting, and they were definitely diverse enough in personality that, you know, we could tell they were feels like real people, and they weren't caricatures. But I definitely, again, felt like Ed was the most relatable, because he felt like his personality and his story was the most complete and the most compelling. And so there were times, like with Big Lindsay, or just Lindsay, where I felt like the characters could have been written with a little bit more authenticity, and a little bit more... I mean, it feels so real, and not a single one of them talk about their periods. Do they?
No.
Like, they talk about sex a lot.
Yeah.
But not a single one of them ever talks about their periods, which seems weird, especially when you're going into like a college situation.
That's a very good point. I didn't think about that.
I didn't think about that till just now. And I think, again, it being kind of a slice of life situation, that's something that these characters would talk about with each other.
Yeah, that is was one of the reasons why I chose this comic as well, is we haven't really had an opportunity yet to interview a male author of a female identified comic. And I would love to hear their point of view on that. Like, right now I'm just speculating and not really sure what their perspective is, but this comic definitely kind of went back and forth with feeling like it was written by a man, on a female perspective. There are times when I felt like it was very accurate, and then there was times where I felt like it was really missing some stuff. And so, we've talked about some of the details of that. But I find that compelling, though, because I feel like as an artist and not being really much, I write, but not to the extent that Beckah does. I would have trouble writing a male character as my lead and continuing with that. I think I could do something short with it, but to make it a series like this would be hard for me. So I'm always compelled by people who choose a character that is opposite their gender and try to do their best at making it accurate or making it, something that would be appropriate. And so I think that this author does the best that he can. I think that it could probably definitely do more. I wonder if he leaned on the female artist. I always think that when they have a collaboration like that, that obviously he must be discussing it with them and they might be talking about that. So I wonder if maybe that's part of it too, because he switches artists about halfway through to a male artist and then goes back to a female artist near the end. And I wonder if he has female friends or if this was part of a personal relationship that he had to his friendship group. And I wonder if he asked them, hey, what do you think about these stories that happened and, and everything. I don't know. There's so many questions around it, but I'm fascinated by people who write the opposite gender and how that pans out in a comic.
Yeah, it's obvious he knows human women like that, like Leigh said, it does kind of go back and forth. There are moments that definitely feel more real than others, and I think there's approximately 1 billion think pieces out there that talk about writing and writing from different character perspectives, and so I don't ever want to limit writers and say, well, only female writers can write female characters or only trans people can write trans characters, especially because we're still kind of behind in our society where there's just not as many people of color or trans people who are getting the recognition that they deserve, or their work published in the way that would saturate the market with those voices. But I definitely think that it does kind of require more research or more conversations or more collaborations. I write a lot of male characters, but I identify as genderqueer, so I kind of identify as male and female or both or neither or whatever. But a lot of my stuff is more science fiction and fantasy based, and so sometimes you can get away from that a little bit if it's not so much about real stuff like premature ejaculation.
That's true.
So I think definitely it requires some method of, like I said, collaboration or research, depending on what you do. And I think with this one, it was just a little bit hit or miss for me.
I agree.
Can you think of, just off the top of your head, female artists or writers that write male characters that you find very compelling?
My first thought on that, because I was thinking about that too, is the opposite, was J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter. I feel like, that's somebody who really put in the time and effort to try and make this character as realistic as possible.
Yeah, that's very true.
Going back on the art style, so this comic started with Lisa Treeman's art style, which is the one that I really appreciated and really spoke to me. It switches halfway through to Max Sarin, and then it switches later on to Julia Madrigal, and then also John Allison does a whole volume of his own artwork. The interesting thing is when it switches halfway through from Lisa to Max's artwork, you can tell that there's a difference, but it's subtle. It's not really extreme, because we've talked about comics previously where they switched artists and it was so different and completely changed the feel of the comic and the story. For instance, like on Rat Queens.
Yes. Yeah.
But for this one, I feel like when they switch artists, it's obvious, but it's not so much that it ruins the comic in some way or it ruins the experience or completely changes it to a different perspective and feel.
I agree. I didn't notice the change, but I got over it so quickly that it didn't really feel like it had that big of an impact on me. So yeah, I enjoyed this comic. I thought it was really fun. I appreciated the recommendation from Leigh. And I will probably read some more volumes because I'm especially interested to see if they'll get more into Daisy's story and her exploration of her personality and sexuality. But it's probably not one that's going to stick with me in the same way that it did for you.
That makes sense, and that's totally okay. Everyone's allowed to have their feelings.
What? Individual
And
opinions. That's bonkers. Well, we have some exciting stuff coming up in the new year. We have a few more interviews lined up, and we have lots more reviews coming up, so stay tuned.
So, this has been another exciting episode of File 741. I'm Leigh.
And I'm Beckah.
Thank you for listening, and please like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can tune into all of our podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, or at thefeminerdfiles.net.